All right, well, let's get started. Thank you so much. This is our second Frontier Mission briefing online that we have hosted. Last week we had the pleasure of hearing from Warren Katz, director and founder of the Center for Technology in Government. Had a really great conversation with him. And today we have with us a man who I think a lot of folks listening know very well. That is, of course, Professor Steve Blank. Uh, Professor Blank, I'll briefly read his bio, is an adjunct professor at Stanford and the co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. Professor Blank consults for the national security establishment on innovation methods, processes, policies, and doctrine. His book, The Four Steps to the Epiphany, is credited with launching the lean startup movement. At Stanford, he co-created the Department of Defense's Hacking for Defense, Department of Defense, Department of War, and the State Department's Hacking for Diplomacy curriculums. His latest class at Stanford is Technology, Innovation, and Great Power Competition, and it is providing critical insight on how technology will shape all elements of national power. Professor Blank, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Thomas. Hopefully the conversation will be longer than the introduction.
Well, so I too teach a class at the University of Chicago, a class in tech-based economic development. And the problem set is familiar to you, I'm sure, and that is we have all this value creation agglomerating in the superstar cities. The Bay Area, of course, Boston, Austin, Seattle, New York, Washington, D.C., and cities like my own, Chicago, fallen behind. On a GDP per capita basis, we last registered 89,000, according to federal data. By comparison, San Francisco, 159,000, Boston, 117,000 GDP per capita, New York, 110. We are not even close to superstar city status, but how do we fix that? So, you have talked a lot about some of the dysfunctions as far as acquisitions from the perspective of the national security industry. I want to kind of invert this conversation a little bit, and that is to suggest, is there a kind of opposing problem in that we're not orienting enough folks in entrepreneurial communities on national security problem sets? And I offer that to suggest that not that, if entrepreneurial communities were more directly focused on national security problem sets, that would be the sole solution to this, problem of agglomerating value creation in superstar cities. But gosh, wouldn't it be a big part of the solution?
The cities you mentioned not only have core defense entrepreneurs, but they have entrepreneurs at scale, period. And I'm not talking about small business entrepreneurship, which is in every city, every country. I'm talking about technology entrepreneurship. And as we know, those kind of are concentrated in clusters in the United States, whether it's Silicon Valley or Boston or Austin, and sometimes domain specific about whether it's biotech, might include San Diego and Boston and South San Francisco. And I think of defense entrepreneurship as a subset of entrepreneurs as a whole. So the first question to be asking around Chicago and the Midwest is, what's the entrepreneurial DNA and density, and more importantly, has risk capital followed, or has the entrepreneurs gotten up and left and went to clusters across the U.S.? First question to ask. I'm not an expert in Chicago, but my bet is most of the technical entrepreneurs have decamped to the other places. May not be true, but seems to be the case. So step one is, how do we keep them down on the farm? And I mean that as as an analog, not specific. And by the way, when I say entrepreneurs, I don't mean the scientists inside the national labs or the quantum labs. Those are scientists. Those are not entrepreneurs, almost always. And for those of you who ever try to pry technology out of a national lab, you'll appreciate the distinction. We don't hire entrepreneurs as a rule inside the labs. We hire world-class researchers and scientists. And those, as you know, and your audience probably understands, very different mindsets, very different skill sets. Combining the two is actually a pretty tough problem. I'm not sure anybody has cracked that at scale, but it does occur. So to now get and answer your question. One is it's a cultural thing about now getting that small pool of entrepreneurs to focus on defense. And what we found, at least at Stanford, is less so defense, but reminding our students who are not ex-military that these are some of the toughest and most interesting problems in the world. Yeah, you want to make a fart app or another social media thing, go at it. But boy, you want to solve things at complexity, whether organizational complexity or technical complexity or size and scale that's unimaginable, or dollars that are going to be thrown at a problem. And these problems as a second order effect, if you're a non-military or haven't served, would actually allow you and your family to sleep safe in your beds at night. That's how we tend to frame our classes. Is if you've been in the military, you immediately appreciate what hacking for defense is. But I'd say 3/4 or even more of our students have never seen or understood the Department of War in their lives, and so we have to start from first principles. Right? And just for your audience, let me remind you, assuming you don't have a defense audience, is that the U.S. Department of War is millions of people. And it's organized in ways that are completely unintuitively obvious to anybody who's sold into commercial companies, that is, into the enterprise. In fact, everything you might know about selling into large corporations will make your company go bankrupt probably in less than a year. Because the Department of War, just the biggest idea, is that the people who need the equipment are different from the people who buy the equipment, who are different than the people who fund the equipment. They're in different organizations. One is Congress. In fact, Congress has two different distinct groups. There's something called the National Defense Authorization Act, which kind of writes down what the military should buy and what weapon systems. And just as you thought, okay, we're got our stuff written into the NDAA, there's another part of Congress that appropriates the money, that is, actually authorizes Congress to spend it, and they might have a different opinion. And back in the military, most people are familiar with services, military services, fancy name for Army, Navy, Marines, Space Force, Air Force. But it turns out the services since 1985 are not actually the organizations that fight the wars. The services are just responsible for recruiting and buying equipment. Oh, that's kind of nice, but wait a minute. The people who actually fight the equipment are something called, use the equipment in a fight or to deter a war, are something called combatant commands, and there are 11 of them. 6 of them are regional, 5 others specialized. And the combatant commands are essentially matrix organizations, which are a fancy term for, I'll take some from column A, some from column B, some from column C, and combine them in a combined organization. So, for example, the one in the Pacific is called Indo-PACOM, and it has Navy, Marines, Air Force, Space Force, etc., Army, all combined to focus on a region. They're the ones that would, if necessary, deter or win a war in the Pacific. Same is true in the Middle East. There's CENTCOM. The same is true in Europe, Eurocom. And then there's a very special combatant command called SOCOM, Special Forces. Historically, none of the combatant commands who fight the wars actually have authority to buy equipment. The only exception is SOCOM. All the other combatant commands are dependent on this whole acquisition chain. That is, acquisition is a very funny word in the military. It depends whether it has a big A or a little a. Big A means, acquisition means who writes the requirement, who budgets the money, who tests it, who then buys it with a small acquisition, who maintains it, etc. That's hundreds of thousands of people in the Department of War. What was your question, Thomas? I just gave you the semester lecture.
Let me try this. I mentioned before we went live how I've watched your secret history of Silicon Valley lecture dozens of times. I assign it for my class at the Harris School of Public Policy at U Chicago. Uh, and if you're watching, you know what I'm talking about. Make sure you search for it on YouTube and watch it yourself. The point Professor Blank makes is that what we know as Silicon Valley now is rooted in defense money. That's a gross summation of it. But I encourage you to take a look. Question is this: can that same story be told in the present day?
Well, the other part of the story was it was an accident, right? The guy who helped start the valley thought it was going to be a microwaves and defense valley. It turned out the next wave was a semiconductor valley. And next wave, which built on top, next wave was a personal computer thing. Then it was an internet valley. Now it's an AI valley. That is, yes, it started in microwaves and defense, but so the answer is for Chicago, you could decide it's a defense valley based on, for example, quantum work coming out of the quantum initiative. Or, gee, I don't know if manufacturing is still part of the Midwest, but when I was young, I used to work in automobile factories and steel plants, and I still remember we made stuff. And if so, that is, what's the expertise that's around there? I'd be making multiple bets if I was doing economic development. I think defense is a likely bet. It has a cultural problem that it took us 5 years in Silicon Valley. When we started the Gordian Knot Center, gosh, about 6 or 7 years ago, it was a pretty lonely time to be talking about defense on a Stanford campus after Snowden and the rest. But it was pretty obvious to some of us who see over the horizon that for the first time ever, the Department of Defense was going to no longer own all the technologies needed to deter or win a war. That is, it was obvious that they were going to have to go out for AI, machine learning, and autonomy, and synthetic biology, and commercial access to space. But it wasn't obvious to the Department of Defense at the time. Luckily, we got funded by the Office of Naval Research that did see over the horizon, and we started helping acquisition folks who were designed to only work with prime contractors and assume our service labs and FFRDCs had the best technology, when in fact in the Valley we were seeing that wasn't the case. So I'm just making the point, it took 6 or 7 years, and in fact Hacking for Defense is now 10 years old. We had armed guards at the door when we first started the classes on Stanford. Now what happened in the last 5 years, which hasn't happened in Chicago, which you guys are trying to start, is that, yeah, nice, we were talking about this, great, the DOW was kind of listening, but then venture capital firms formed solely focused on funding defense startups. Shield Capital, Ross Shaw, who was the second head of the Defense Innovation Unit, and others have spun up, other VCs, A16Z and whatever, has said, hey, we can make money on this. And then, of course, having a couple billionaires start, Anduril and SpaceX, and use their money not first to only build the product, but to sue the hell out of the Air Force and the Army to actually get traction. I'd add Palantir as well. They and the early VCs are the ones that kind of pioneered this ecosystem. At the same time, we were creating a cadre of students who were interested and engaged on the toughest problems. So what I'm trying to point out is that there was an ecosystem that happened not through coordination, but actually one watching each other and going, look at SpaceX and Andrew. Oh, look at what we're doing with our students. Oh, fine. And what happened this year or last year is finally, at least for the acquisition part of the Department of War, private equity acquired it. And what I mean by that is the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Feinberg, was the head of Cerebus, or co-founder, a $70 billion private equity fund. Head of the Army came from private equity. His number 2 comes from private equity. Same for the Navy. So now we have people who actually understand how to write tens, hundreds of billions of dollars of checks, where before we had people who never managed a lemonade stand in charge of aircraft carriers and F-35s. And the results kind of showed that. And this wasn't they were dumb or bad. It's just that they had no experience at deploying capital at scale. And what you're seeing inside the Department of War right now is essentially what PEs do, private equity firms do, to roll up organizations. They kind of take all the silos, they put them together. This is this new structure called the portfolio acquisition executive. They kill things that aren't working. They have rapid paths to, I mean, we're just seeing private equity at play. So back to your question about Chicago, I would be thinking hard about the multiple pieces focused on entrepreneurs, not just policy. How do we kickstart multiple entrepreneurs working on serious problems for the DOW, and how do we make that attractive? And to be honest, while I teach in the policy side of Stanford as well as the engineering side, the real traction is when you start teaching engineering students how to get engaged, because all of a sudden they're building things that are tangible that could be demoed and deployed, literally now. Policy is important, but delivery matters. Did I answer a question, Thomas? Or did I answer some other question?
No, you did. You did.
George, jump in.
No, just as you're talking, one of the challenges, and I've been a university professor and I've, worked with startups. How do you get everybody to play together on the same thing? Challenge with students, they're there for a semester or there till they get a degree and then they're off somewhere else. And then you've got different startups popping up and hopefully they can get enough funding to keep going. But as you look at all of these different components, and if you're trying to build that model of what does the ideal model look like to provide for the acquisition, what does that look like? I guess that's one ongoing challenge I have.
Yeah, so this is kind of like, in the old days there used to be a show called Ed Sullivan Show, and I'm old enough to remember one of the guests they used to have all the time was someone who would spin multiple plates on a stick simultaneously. I mean, they'd run around and it was like, in hindsight, you kind of go, really, that was entertainment. But that is exactly what you need to do. You need to be thinking about spinning multiple plates. So plate number one is, I need engineering students engaged in national security problems and not reading about them. But a hacking for defense model is essentially a shorthand for experiential, hands-on, teams-based. We're actually going to get out of the building and not just admire a problem, but try to understand it and then solve it in 10 weeks, in a quarter. That's one activity, right? The second activity is to do that, you need to build a relationship with a series of potential sponsors of problems. So all of a sudden, right, and what's nice about Hacking for Defense, it comes with a nonprofit called the Common Mission Project that actually sources problems for universities where professors don't have those relationships. So all of a sudden you could meet sponsors and try to understand not only the front doors from DIU and the Army Fuse program and others, but there are just multiple, like tons of places that would love to give you problems, including the intelligence community. The third is and again, inside the university, and I'm not suggesting it'll work where you guys teach, but I kind of operated on the it's better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission model. I'm not sure after 10 years Hacking for Defense is even an approved class, though it's now in 68 universities and written into the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm only being facetious, it is now. But finding a senior faculty sponsor who will run deep cover for us in terms of the politics. So at Stanford, it was Tom Byers in the engineering school. Retired Colonel Joe Filter was the executive director of Gordian Knot, ran enormous, cover, and then got Mike McFaul, ex-ambassador to Russia, who ran CSAC, the Center for International Security Studies at Stanford, to kind of run interference as well. So, understanding that the university is a bureaucratic whatever, finding senior folks to run cover for these programs were incredibly important, and building a community. The other thing I'll just mention is that, when I started these programs, I designed them for scale. There's nothing for me that are wastes than building a class at a university and not realizing that you ought to open source it. A couple of universities are still trying to figure out, wait a minute, how did he open source our class? Again, I'll leave that for someone else to figure out. But the goal is if you're building it once, you should actually make sure you have built a little manual on how others could teach it and how others could deploy it in their own place. So the answer is engage students in the engineering side, engage warfighters as sponsors, get political cover inside of universities, start bringing in, at least in Chicago, like every great metropolis, must be tons of people write seed round checks, engage them as mentors, particularly get them engaged in writing seed checks for defense startups, so you get them exposed and start. That's what I mean about the multiple plates, and you're probably already doing all these things. But build an insurgency of committed people who think it's important to do this, not only for the country but in Chicago. And again, the one initiative I am familiar with is the one you mentioned, which is the Quantum Initiative. There must be others inside of national labs around you guys, and other things that you could kind of say, well, why don't we start here? There must be 3 or 4 others. Thomas, you're smiling like I've already suggested everything you're doing.
Maybe. like, like as I told you before we went on, just having you on and sharing your thoughts and your interest in the national security sector and sharing it with our community here in Chicago does immeasurable help for us. At least I hope. I did want to ask a few questions. I structured this to kind of go outside in, meaning like how do we drive more interest from the outside into the national security sector, and then I'll flip it around to some commentary in a recent piece you wrote about kind of the inside out challenge and some of the acquisitions challenges that the U.S. military has faced. On the first half of this conversation, I did want to ask one more question, and that is, you have cast doubt on if dual use pathways are even a thing. Would you mind expounding a little bit on that and just
Sure.
walk through your thoughts?
I think it's probably first worth defining what dual use is to people who might not be familiar. Dual use is just a fancy, $10 word for a simple idea is, can you sell your same product to commercial companies as well as the Defense Department? Or can something you're building for defense, can you sell it commercially or vice versa? And that seems to be kind of a pretty logical thing to do. Great, I have 2 different markets. Well, if you remember way back when in my preamble, the commercial sales and defense sales look nothing like each other. So number 1 is you need a different sales force. Number 2 is reaching those people are completely different. Oh, great. So your marketing dollars or whatever you're going to spend to create demand, completely different. Oh, the DoD has security and paperwork that you would never believe. Commercial terms are different and have different security and whatever. So there's just a big chunk of overhead that there's no economies of scale. It might be that some products, the products themselves, are easily transferable. What I found, and so full stop, it's not as easy as it just sounds. So dual use is not just easy. The second part, and the one that matters, is VCs, venture capitalists who invest in defense, have strong opinions on both sides. And so I believe kind of which one should you do? I believe you follow the golden rule, which says he who has the gold makes the rules. So I would be asking, your potential investors, what do they think about dual use? Some say defense first, and then, if you have slop later and you've proven it, it's a great prototype for commercial. Some believe otherwise. Gee, if you have some sales in commercial, some other believe, like I do, I will now give you my opinion, is that some of the problems for the Defense Department and the dollars available right now in the next couple of years would tend to want you to focus your efforts on defense. So my personal opinion, though again I'm not the one writing the big checks, would be I would find big scalable defense problems and focus on that. And then later on, if there are commercial ways to do that when you're large enough, usually as a startup, it's kind of, I won't say impossible, but very difficult to do with limited resources, both of those distinct markets simultaneously in your early days. That's my 2 cents. But again, I was being serious. Who's ever writing you the biggest check and is going to be on your board, I'd be making sure your interests and theirs are aligned. That's, by the way, a heuristic I teach my students is the minute you take money from someone, their business model becomes yours. So if you don't understand your investor's business model before you have them on your board, you might be the ex-CEO, or at worst, your company might be out of business. Just as an aside. All right, did I answer your question, Thomas? So the answer is maybe. Definite business school. In fact, the business school, in engineering school, an answer is either yes or no. In the business school, it's always, well, it depends. So I gave you the, well, it depends answer.
Excellent. I want to ask you about your phone book and your directory. And I'm going to do that by first reading just an excerpt from an opinion you wrote recently in Defense Scoop that I caught. I'm reading directly here. You write, acquisition in the DOW is being reorganized how a private equity firm would reorganize a large company. They bring in or empower a new operating team, swap executives, change incentives, kill things not core to their mission, cut costs, invest for growth, and restructure to find additional financing. You later write, a more productive approach, one that delivers truly decisive capabilities, would be to build a different process up front, a rigorous problem identification and validation phase on the front end of every acquisition program. This process would start with a wide funnel of problems, ideas, and technology, each with a 10-line problem summary that describes the specific challenges to address, why it can't be solved currently, what it would take to solve it, and how a solution will be funded and deployed in the field. The way I took that particular piece of what you wrote is the need to get connected with the warfighter and understand the problem sets and be in the closest degree of proximity with the end users in a way that we just have not been able to facilitate. Can you speak to a little bit about that and how this directory that you have produced might solve that challenge?
Yeah, so I'll say maybe. That's what I said. And partly. So number one, what's been missing in any of this system, or at least the way we wrote requirements, was this long disconnect from the warfighter and the time that things are needed. So that's number one. But part of this 10-liner, and part of it is exactly what we do in Hacking for Defense, is almost always, the assumption is, almost always smart people believe they not only understand the problem on day one, but they could pre-compute the solution. So therefore, we end up writing specs. So what is if you spend time with warfighters, you will certainly understand now for the first time what warfighters need. But then I ask my students, great, can the warfighters write the check and acquire the system? Well, of course not, unless it's, something on their credit card or they're sneaking in from their families sending them care packages. Okay, well, who could acquire this stuff? Well, I don't know. The warfighter is just saying, I get this thing. Well, there's acquisition people. Great. Well, have you spent any time with them? Oh, who are they? Well, I don't know. Well, wait a minute. How did they decide they need to buy something? Well, it was written in the NDA and they got a requirement. Well, who are the requirements people? Well, I don't know. Oh, well, wait a minute. Who's the staffers on the House and Senate Armed Services Committee that are focused on this weapon system? Well, I don't know. That's not my job. Well, it turns out that meeting with a warfighter is a great start. It's not don't do that. But it turns out there are multiple stakeholders in getting any system deployed. And the mistake is not just meeting with the warfighter, because then you go, all I need to do is build X, and not understanding that Lockheed has a $2.2 billion contract with factories in every Senate and House committee that, and this thing ain't ever changing regardless of what the warfighter thinks. So the whole idea about the 10-liner is, yes, we're going to make it a 10-liner, but we're getting out of the building and understand the entire set of needs and figure out how to adjudicate, that is, decide which one do we attack first. Do we make sure we're solving a warfighter problem, get them to talk to the PEOs, and then get the PEOs engaged back to the requirements writer saying you're giving us the wrong requirement, or do we spin this up from a House and Senate staffer who's having a hearing with General so-and-so that says, how come you're not supporting them? Does that make sense? So it turns out in the DLW, unless you could actually map all this stuff, and now back to the directory, there was no possible way, even people in the service for 20 years would know who all those people are, because there's no phone book. I mean, there are specific phone books, and when you have a CAT card, you could that is a access card in the Department of Defense. Sometimes you could get in and get individual department or organizations phone books. But there's no publicly available thing if you're a startup and without a clearance. And if you have a clearance, then you can't share this anyway because it's either controlled information or classified. So so let me exhale. So I wrote now a 400-page directory that I update monthly or sometimes quarterly of all the organizations in the Department of Defense, with names of people, and the PDF version has hot links to their LinkedIn or open source pages. And it was all derived out of OSINT, open source information. I won't touch anything that the DoD doesn't publish or that names aren't already on LinkedIn, with the observation that says, here I am, one guy doing this. You got to believe our adversaries have at least 2 people, if not 200 people. And again, this would not have been a good idea 10 years ago when this information was not available publicly. But since it all is, our adversaries are probably doing this as well, and so the only people who don't have access are people who want to sell to the DOW and the people inside the DOW who need to find out who these other players are. In fact, half the people downloading this directory are people inside the Department of War, which just kind of blew me away. I actually wrote the first 30 pages or so were kind of a how to sell to the DOW handbook, which answered 10 years of questions my students had. But then the rest really is this phone book part. And so I never expected until I started getting calls from J8s and J5s and other combatant commands going, oh, we never knew who the PEO was for the weapon system we were actually using. So that's just a long story. If you want to see the directory or figure out where to download it, just go to steveblank.com, and there's a little picture on the side of the home page of something in a plum-colored book. If you click on it, it'll allow you to download the PDF for free, or get on an update list. So when we come out with new updates, or actually buy a hard copy at cost, whatever Amazon charges us. Kind of nice to have one on the desktop as well. Thomas, was that your question, or did I answer?
No, what I was getting at is, I'm kind of trying to focus what the folks listening to this conversation might use and work with.
So what they might use and work with is just, the nice part is just if you're thinking about building drones, search the word drones or UAS, counter UAS, and you will find every organization, name, person, etc. in the DOW is responsible for them. And then I'd figure out both in the combatant commands and in the services.
So George, I know, is monitoring questions. There are some folks on YouTube who may have some questions for Professor Blank with our remaining time. Please get them in you're looking at George.
Yes, actually, what is Steve Blank's answer? What does Steve Blank's model look like for success?
For success for who? For a startup or for the government or for? It's a great question, but which one? I could answer both.
Not clear. I think they're looking at the acquisition. Looking at acquisition. What's the model for success for acquisition?
You mean for the country for acquisition, the defense for acquisition?
Overall, yes. Overall. Investors, startups, government.
Yeah. So let me go down the list. I think and let me put a pin in a subject we should get back in Chicago, is being able to separate out the ideological component of this administration from the needs of the Department of War, because that really affects students' abilities to want to engage who've not been engaged before. The DOW is not ICE, thank God. It's not the border. Whatever you think about the ideology, that's not what we're talking about. Eventually, we might have to, but we're not. That's not part of this conversation, and nor is it part of the acquisition conversation. Secretary Hegseth actually said it just unambiguously what the goal of acquisition is. We need to deliver things with speed and urgency, and we fail to do that in a timely manner. I mean, speed, urgency, and good enough. And we actually had 70, 65 years of cruft in our acquisition process that we confused optimizing the process versus optimizing delivery. It's a big idea. We put every rule, regulation, this thing called the National Defense Authorization Act, which Congress writes, which says what the military can spend and buy. In 1961, you know how many pages it had? Any idea, guys? How many pages?
Not
One.
back then, I can tell you today.
One. Today, this year's 3,400 pages. Now think about that, right? Who reads 3,400 pages? Well, you're supposed to, because we just spent lots of time with lots of people who thought their jobs was moving the paper from one end of the Pentagon to the other, which might have taken years. And by the way, that was okay in the Cold War when our adversary was the Soviet Union, who had an equally complex and Byzantine system. And when we became the only superpower, when the Soviet Union fell apart, ISIS and Al-Qaeda were using pencil and paper and maybe Excel. But in the last 10 or 15 years, China emerged as not just a near peer. Some places were the near peer. Well, what system do they use? Well, on a good day, General Motors, the Department of Defense operated like General Motors, and China adopted Silicon Valley methodologies, which basically was the lean methodology we kind of developed, which says build minimum viable products, rapidly test them, iterate them, and everything that matters is speed and urgency and deployment in front of customers. Meanwhile, we were still operating on a paperwork process that said, gee, .mlpf, 30-year life cycles, whatever, which might have made sense for aircraft carriers, but doesn't make sense for attritable systems like drones and the rest. And our acquisition system didn't keep up with these ideas. What came in the last year was a radical view that says we're going to rip this out from root and branch. This is just the system we put in place doesn't work. It can't. We can't keep going on like this, and we just see it numerically. The number of DDGs or destroyers China puts in the water every year versus us. The number of generations of aircrafts they're building, in not only the number. And to me, the one that no one talks about is the North Korea missile systems that they've developed in the last 10 years. They've developed 6 more missile systems than we have in the last 40. We can't even keep up with North Korea. I mean, that's a little embarrassing. Our Sentinel, ICBM replacement is, we're going to spend probably $250 billion, and we're still in paperwork. So our system is essentially collapsing, or had collapsed under its own weight, which was kind of okay when there was no adversary that was using a different system. It's now pretty clear that it needed to change. The problem in any large organization when you make changes like this is that the folks in the middle, that is the professionals who've been around doing their jobs and doing their jobs as per what they were taught to do. There was a whole university for acquisition called Defense Acquisition University that taught you how to move the paperwork. Well, now we essentially need a re-education camp for that middle. What could go wrong is, people in the middle just saying, well, we'll wait this out. We'll wait till this administration changes and we'll wait till the primes now become, important again and blah, blah, blah. The problem is that's not good for the country. What's good for the country is actually the concepts that we've put in place in the last year, which said we'll take anything now versus waiting for perfect later, right? Perfect is the enemy of what's needed. So, Thomas, I think I answered your question.
Yes, sir. Yeah, you did, absolutely. So a couple things. I did notice in the comments some technical difficulties we had at the beginning. I apologize. I moved this YouTube conversation over to my personal one because I couldn't connect it to the Frontier Mission Network channel. This is being recorded. If anybody missed some of the initial moments of our conversation because of that mishap, we'll make sure you get the full recording. You mentioned the element of politics. I just wanted to, and I have in the past with some commentaries that I've written and shared with our network. This is an apolitical thing we're doing. This is bipartisan, and we have always invited everybody from the full ideological spectrum into what we think is a good common goal, and that is modernizing the American defense industrial base. And on that topic, is, of course, the topic of manufacturing. Historically, we are rooted in manufacturing here in Chicago. We've lost a great deal of that manufacturing since the steel plants closed over the last 30, 40 years, U.S. Steel, Acme Steel, Wisconsin Steel. Now, according to PitchBook, we have seen manufacturing defense investment rise from $500 million annually in 22 to 23 to $4.7 billion in 2025 across 39 deals. We've seen a lot of defense-focused manufacturing venture investment. Can you just offer some general commentary on the need to reshore our defense industrial base and how we can capture these promising trends in the national security sector in the context of Chicago?
Well, again, for your audience, just remind them why this is important. It's pretty clear that the U.S. and China are kind of, disconnecting their systems. None of our iPhones made in China, but much more important stuff like critical minerals that are necessary for production of everything from magnets that go into electric cars to rocket engines and the rest, but also components. If you want to build a drone today, try to get those little motors that are necessary. They're made in China, or try to get a whole set of things in what's called the supply chain. Everything from the raw materials all the way to some of the things you would expect, including, by the way, most of our antibiotics are made in China now. So number one is getting manufacturing, onshoring this thing is not just a thing, it's a whole series of critical things. Some of them essential for our economy, and others are essential for our military industrial base. And this administration has started to do some radical things to do that. One is taking equity stakes, that is, acting as an investor, certainly in mines. Whoever thought that? Doing joint ventures in, I think it was with, I forget who, for rocket motors and actually doing spin-outs, et cetera. And that just means that areas like Chicago should be thinking about what is it that we could create, or what industries can we attract that could be a partner with the U.S. government for things on this critical path. There's a huge opportunity. There's an office in the Department of Defense in the directory called the Office of Strategic Capital. There's another Office of Economic Development. Just be talking to those groups and try to understand. And they all publish, what are the important things on that supply chain. Just to show you how important this is, China, decided to cut off Japan from critical minerals, period. And Japan is now thinking about mining the seabed, to get minerals that they no longer have access to. China's so willing to use those threats of those materials. By the way, the whole Indo-PACOM, that is the tension in the South China Sea, are not just over air bases that China's illegally building near the Philippines and Vietnam, but it's over Taiwan, which China just simply says is a breakaway province. Like in our civil wars, it would be like Virginia still being an independent state. They're saying, well, that's Taiwan. The problem for the West is that more than 90% of our advanced logic chips are made in Taiwan from one company called TSMC. Now, if China somehow owns Taiwan and they decide to control semiconductors as they're controlling critical minerals, that's a body blow to not just the U.S. and not just defense, but the entire Western economy. So if you really think about it, we might go to war over 2 nanometers. That is the size of the next generation semiconductors. Well, that seems silly. I want you to remember in the 90s, we fought 2 wars over oil. Semiconductors are the new oil of the 21st century. And so when we're thinking about all this defense buildup in the South China Sea, we're actually struggling for control of assets for the 21st century. And critical minerals being one, but semiconductors being another. I think we're going to see more and more investment from the Department of War. And what it means for Chicago and the Midwest is being able to reverse engineer, well, what are those needs and how can we play? And who could play? And who are the biggest investors in that area who haven't thought about taking their commercial things and partnering with the DoW.